My name's Tom Lloyd. I'm one of the founders and directors of PearsonLloyd. Luke, my partner, is sitting on the front row. We're going to split this session into two. I'm going to sort of do an introduction around the theme that we've been talking about, and then Luke's going to talk about some of our work through the kind of lens of the ideas that we've been playing with for this presentation. So we run a studio in East London. We've been going for about 23 years. We work across a variety of sectors, spaces, types of work. A lot of it is the furniture sector, and is this industry that we're sharing today. Workplace furniture, contract furniture, domestic furniture. We also move across into, we do a lot of work in the aviation sector, a lot of work in the healthcare sector. We design consumer products. We also do a lot of strategic work and sort of thinking on behalf of our clients. And we've been doing some thinking today about why and how we're designing, and especially in the context of the sort of the real focus on sustainability. We've been just trying to figure out a response for our work in that context. I'm going to do a little bit of reading from the script and a little bit of talking, because the themes that we've been working on are quite specific. So we from the title, History in the Making, we've been really thinking about the act of making as designers, and how making influences our future, our history. Because everything we make today becomes our history tomorrow, literally. And as producers and consumers, we have to be more and more aware of what that means in terms of a sustainable and an environmental kind of context. So design is essentially an act of making, a convergence of the solving of problems, the response to functional needs, the use of local materials and crafts, and the application of decorative art. Now, these rakes probably wouldn't have been seen as decorative art when they were made, but very quickly their cultural resonance changes depending on who's looking at them. So even that is interesting to us. We, as humans, have never really been without the act of making, or for us, the act of designing. It just wasn't called design in the past. In any town or village, in any country around the world, our historical visual culture, from hammer to house, is a reflection of those crafts. It's a reflection of the materials, the needs, and the arts of that particular locality. So what we make today becomes our history tomorrow. Our future history is literally made every day, and that's what we want to sort of focus in on. Design is also a trade, a business, and a commercial venture. We're all here in this hall to earn a living and to add value both to the users of our ideas and our products and the makers and sellers of those ideas. So we're in a commercial environment. By human nature and in the interest of success, we all seek to innovate. Yes, we solve problems, but we also look for opportunities and new ways of exploiting resources. Now, this is a favorite image of ours because we're not sure whether this was a bestseller, but clearly someone had an idea about the kind of confluence of camping and driving. And it's just a lovely sense of, sort of optimistic sense of innovation sitting in the design world. In the last 200 years, the means of production and consumption have changed from a local position to a national and then a global position. So the means of production and consumption have changed completely. And as designers, in the lives of the people who consume our ideas and our work, and in the fabric of the world we live in, we make that history, and that's what we're trying to figure out. Particularly in the last 2 decades, globalization alongside the wonders of tech have created business models and platforms that we never knew existed, and which are driving entirely new patterns of production and distribution and consumption. This has sort of normalized levels of consumption that we never imagined, our parents and our grandparents even never imagined was possible. And we've somehow persuaded ourselves that level of consumption is a wonderful thing. The principles of fast food, which was always a bit of a joke, has suddenly migrated to fast fashion, now fast furniture, and almost fast everything. And tech, I think as an industry, we've been seduced by the opportunities that technology affords us, but it's also generating a process of sort of carbon consumption that has maybe never existed before. We've also developed new behaviours that distort, our humanity in a way, and become almost vulgar, almost ugly. I mean, this is an extraordinary image of people watching a classical concert through their lenses, and we couldn't imagine that the inventors of the phone or the Wi-Fi or the internet would not imagine that this was an aspiration as a cultural kind of collecting point. But so we have sort of unintended consequences of every action, and that's what we mean by history in the making. Everything we do today somehow can get diverted and twisted into what is a reality tomorrow. When making was a local affair, the impact, good and bad, was kept local. Now that the means of production has become global, so the impact of our actions have become global. In the UK, our carbon per person, our carbon consumption as an economy has gone down in the last 20 years, but that's mainly because we've offshored our production. So our consumption has gone up, but our own local carbon production has gone down. If we actually calculated the amount of carbon we're using from the production offshore, it would be a very different perception. And so this global world has distorted our realities in a very, very particular way. Now, the upside is progress of change and of tech. And this was clearly seen as progress 100 years ago. The downside is that the yesterday's heroes can easily turn into today's villains. And suddenly, from the kind of intensity of an urban life to the sort of traumas of an urban life, it's a very quick move from what was seen as an optimistic position to suddenly becomes a challenging one. So this is an image that we've used a few times, and it's I'm sure some of you have seen this image of a dead bird in a Pacific island full of probably our own toothbrushes. And we now, I think we've all been surprised by the speed at which our consciousness and understanding of the threat to our world via consumption has changed in the last 12 months. Every one of our clients, every one of our conversations are now reflecting what it means to be in the world now and how we can respond to that. And I think we're all trying to figure out what that response might be. Now, while in a way this is a remote image, it's a long way away, it's quite shocking, but it's quite in the distance. When that reality starts to get closer to home, whether it's Tai Chi in Shanghai or whether it's somewhere on the eastern seaboard of Australia, the realities of global warming are having now a very clear link to our actual daily lives, and I think it's stimulating a response in a very different way. It has to, and we are. It kind of really is time for change. I think there's always been a group and a body and a narrative around what it means to live in a consumer-oriented world, and I think a lot of us could almost pick and choose that narrative locally and at will. I think that's beginning to change to the point that unless we are involved in a response that's active and progressive and optimistic as well, because this isn't only a negative position, we've really got to take that on board and make that understanding clear. So as soon as it becomes physical and real, that's the moment when I think we're more likely to respond. So the question that we've been thinking ourselves through this little talk is, how can design make a positive impact? Because it's not just about reduction of consumption or making things out of recyclable furniture, materials only. There's a load of different thematics around a positive contribution. And we're not standing here as from a high position of saying we know how to do it. We're more standing here from a position of how can we start to change our own behaviours to help and to contribute to some change. And for us, it's a positive moment rather than a negative moment. It's not we can't just beat ourselves with the kind of maybe the depressing side of change. We have to also see that as opportunity. So we've over the last little while we've been talking about this idea of eye and mind at the studio. Now, design has always sat at the intersection of science and art, and in a way, this is a different reflection of that. Beauty has always been allied with a strategic sort of idea of why. I think the strategic has to become, from our point of view, has to become much more daily, much more real, much more relevant. Why does a product exist? It's one of the first things that Luke and I ask with every project is actually what's the purpose of the project, and what's the value and what's the cost. And that cost isn't only a physical thing about money. It's the social cost. It's the environmental cost. It's the wider context. So that tension between the sort of emotional position of design, which is still very, very powerful, and the physical one, which is about function and about the tactile use of something, is I think becomes that alliance between those two sets of ideas become more and more important. And eye and mind is our kind of lens into that set of thinking. I think the other thing we wanted to say was that, we're all here earning our living because of, as I was mentioning earlier, because of design and because of the act of making and creating. And we can't discard those professions. Well, that's not what we're saying, because it's what feeds and clothes us. But what we can do is begin to have a different lens of responsibility, if you like. The great founder of Patagonia says there's no such thing as a sustainable producer. You can be a responsible producer. It's very, very hard to be a sustainable producer because the act of consumption always has a cost. So for us, it's more about, I think that's a really nice way of looking at it. It's more about a sense of responsibility rather than sustainability, because sustainability at its heart is a very hard thing. The pure net zero carbon and circular process is as a systemic thing, is a very hard thing to achieve. So all we're asking is, can we make better decisions? So from our perspective, the first place to start is people. Actually all our actions and whether it's at a local, national or global level, people is the ground, is the sort of ground zero of all our conversations and all our perceptions and all our outputs. In that context, we've been discussing and thinking and looking and reading about Victor Papanak in recent days and weeks and months. And Victor Papanak was a writer, designer, thinker, working mainly in the 60s and 70s, or becoming very influential in the 60s and 70s. And it's interesting, he's always been influential, but there seems to be a resurgence of his language, and when you look at it, even from 50 years ago, it becomes incredibly powerful. So there's 3 quotes here just to warm up the process. So the first one is, the only important thing about design is how it relates to people, which is just what we were saying. The second one, which is a little bit harsh for us all, is there are professions more harmful than industrial design, but only a few. Now that's quite a tough thing to swallow when it's what we do all the time, but it does bring home a little bit that idea of what are we doing? And the third one is, design, if it is to be ecologically responsible and socially responsive, must be revolutionary and radical. Now, a lot of the work in this hall is practical, pragmatic, it's fulfilling function, it's serving need. So how can you be radical within that context? That's a sort of not quite paradoxical position, but it's one that we all have to figure out, because you've got to be radical on a daily level, and that's something that we're all sort of making sense of. And as I said earlier, we're not shining knights of this movement. We're just using this language to sort of reflect back on the work we've done in the last 10 or so years and what bits we see as relevant. I think we're also interested in being designers by nature or entrepreneurial. When you think of an idea, either with a client or a producer about a use of material or a thought or a business model, we have to. I think the entrepreneurial spirit is something that is one of the routes to solving some of these problems or responding to some of these problems. This is an image of a salad farm in one of the disused railway lines in London, and it uses redundant power from the wind farms at night. It has a perfect, even 14 degrees temperature without any heating, and there's no transport cost to all the restaurants in London. So this is quite an extreme example, but someone has put together a series of opportunities and thoughts and created a business that is intentionally responding to a particular problem in the world. Now, that's just one example, but it's I think the aspiration to be entrepreneurial is something we're particularly interested in, and we see that as an optimistic position, this isn't meant to be a sort of pessimistic idea. It's an optimistic idea of what it is. How can we raise our own level of performance and our own perception of what's right and wrong? We talk a lot about the idea of relevance and transformation, both from a user perspective and from a client perspective. We have to add in the sort of social perspective of that, whether it's why we're doing it or what the impact is of our work. And I think that's something that those three, in a way, stakeholders, user, client, and society, have to be woven into every project that we do. So I'm going to pass on to Luke now, who's going to just use these thoughts as a way of talking about some of our work.
Thank you. So just to follow on from Tom's sort of thoughts about the kind of global issues and global problems, over the last 2 years, we've actually been spending a lot of time looking at the work of the studio and trying to understand, first of all, what we can do to change things in our behavior, but also how it's affected the projects that we've been working on over the past sort of 10 to 20 years. And we're going to start by this rather obtuse brief that we got from the Department of Health. And it was to reduce violence and aggression in emergency departments. And I think when we won the project, which was a pitch, they thought we'd design some really sort of nice soft furniture and maybe some elegant screens to keep people apart in accident emergency departments, because there's a huge amount of aggression and violence between the people there, but also towards the staff, which results in high stress, lost working hours, and misery, basically. However, we started looking at the problem and realized actually that furniture wasn't really going to solve anything. We had something much more sort of systemic at the root of things. And so we did a very deep research looking at all the various stakeholders, from the patients to the staff, the doctors, the nurses, the organization. And the insight was that actually you've got a very peculiar group of people. If I look around the room here, we're all kind of the same. We're all interested in design. We've all probably have a relatively good education. The fact that I'm speaking in English and you all understand me is pretty extraordinary. If you look in the accident emergency department, you've got people of pretty much every single age. You've got people who are mentally unwell, sitting next to some very fragile elderly person who might have been brought in by, their young ones, effectively. You've got people who are drunk, who've just committed a crime, and you've got people who are drunk, who've just had a crime committed against them, all in the same place. So one of the insights was actually that communication was key. People didn't know what was happening to them while they were at hospital. I've got this bleeding arm, why isn't somebody seeing to me? When somebody who's just come in is rushed through. So this mapping process that we did in the studio suddenly became evident as a potential solution. That if we could create a tool that would allow people to understand how to communicate with each other, then maybe that would dissipate some of the stress and the anger. So we trialed this, and the results were quite profound. And it was a beautiful kind of moment for us, because we realized that actually design was as much to do with the simplicity of communication as the physical object itself. And this has now been rolled out into over 20 hospital trusts in the UK. So in terms of a kind of an efficient solution, an economic one, as a contrast, we all work in offices, or most of us do, and we've been sold through industrialization a kind of idea that complexity and sophistication will create progress. And the office is a great example of that. This image of Jack Tati in Playtime looking out over the sea of sameness, everybody in their own little cell with all the things that they'll need to make them productive. And this has kind of been exploded. And what's interesting for us is obviously it's hugely wasteful on materials. It also suggests human beings are all absolutely identical. And actually what we're seeing at the moment, especially with technology, is a liberation of how people can work and interact with each other, which is really interesting for us. And about 6 years ago, Technion, big Canadian company, asked us to design for them. And they actually have a very, very sophisticated systems culture. So they can produce all those little offices, but they realized change was required. So we said that we'd like to do a thought piece for them first. And actually what we decided to do was to try and reduce everything down to as little as possible to talk about the issues which actually facilitated communication and work between people. So, it was obviously playful. And on the left-hand side, we have a hat stand. And it was really about this idea of what do you need to make yourself feel at home? Human beings need to have a sense of place. Sometimes it's as simple as somewhere to put your coat or your hat. And then, of course, in this sort of era where we're FaceTiming people, we're Skyping, we're digital communication, we're emailing people who are only 10 meters away in the same office to ask them a question, then you email them back. We were trying to remind everybody that actually physical interaction is critical between people. So the love seat in the middle was to bring two people together to remind people of the importance of physical intimacy. And then on the right-hand side, it was really celebrating in a way that technology liberates us. So this is the kind of office of the future. It's just a perch, it's a tiny table, and somewhere to hang your bag. And it was actually saying that you're the most important thing in this equation here. What we place around us should be secondary to the human needs. So it was getting back to the idea of what's essential. And I guess at this point we have to put in this slide because, as Tom was saying earlier, we always ask ourselves what intrinsically is important to the brief. And the idea of essential is difficult because as human beings, we are, in a way, conditioned to seek novelty. We're conditioned to seek newness. There's something in us. We're always looking for something that's different. And I guess what we have to try and understand is, within these sort of ideas and these sometimes rather poetic and artistic concepts, what's valuable? And sometimes it just makes them obsolete and creates huge amounts of waste. At other times, there are germs of things which are really very valuable. So this idea of novelty is something that we, in a way, try and react against in the studio. We try and always give our products as much longevity as possible. And you can do that in many different ways. This is a street furniture system for Bath. And one of the things we wanted to do, it's a historic city, you probably all know it in Britain. They hate the idea of change because they want to preserve everything just the way it is. So we generated this idea that actually if we could generate something or build something that had a very long life, they'd feel safe with this. So we proposed that everything should be made in bronze and brass, which obviously is going to be very expensive. But actually when we went through the whole life cost, you don't have to paint it, it doesn't rust, it's not going to corrode in any way. And if at any time they do get bored with it, you can melt it down and probably the value of the raw material will be more in the future than what you paid for it today. And so it got accepted and then celebrated and installed throughout the city, which for us was a great win because it was about this idea of instilling quality when actually we're in a kind of a time when everybody expects to get everything cheaper, cheaper, cheaper. And we were trying to fight against that. The other thing was to kind of future-proof it and recognize that things do wear out and deteriorate. And if the company that made it isn't around, who repairs it? So the benches were designed with this bronze frame, and then the slatted wood. If one of the slats break, pretty much anybody can make a new one and fix it in place. So for us, making efficiently is really important. And this sketch was, in a way, the germ of a brief in response to a project brief that we got. And the client wanted us to produce a family of plastic chairs. And I think plastic, the slide Tom just presented there, it's being demonized, but it's much more complex than that. Plastic's actually an extraordinary material. To make a plastic chair actually requires a very small amount of energy. If you make chairs out of other materials, they all require energy. Steel requires energy, aluminium, even if the raw material has been recycled. So it's not that one-dimensional. Secondarily, plastic is a material you can get a second life out of with very little energy. It melts very easily and can be remolded into another material. However, if you're using a raw material which is going to be made in huge numbers, you have to think very carefully about what you do with it. So the family of products that we built was, first of all, we wanted it to be elegant and minimal and to some degree timeless, although we can never decide what is timeless. Only the market decides what's timeless. But all the frames are interchangeable, which means that we have a very small number of parts which can be fitted together to give a very large number of permutations for the end customer. So the embedded energy in the production is very small, considering the number of outcomes that you get. All the parts can be disassembled. For example, the starbase on the end, just like Magistretti used to tell us at college, at the RCA, he used to say, first of all, make it so it breaks, and then work out where to put the material back. And we're in this sort of world these days of litigation and people suing. Everybody wants to make things much stronger than they need to be. So we persuaded the client, let's do the opposite. Let's take the material away to the minimum and only put back what we have to. And when you're making tons and tons of product, you really have to consider these small incremental changes. So a kind of completely different process. Industrial production and probably the Industrial Revolution has sold us all the idea we can own everything we want. Everybody's got this very complex piece of technology in their pocket, an iPhone. There's probably nobody here without a smartphone in their pocket. The raw materials to make that are extraordinary. And we've built a world where everybody expects to be able to own everything. But actually, this is relatively new. It wasn't that long ago that you would borrow things from your neighbors if you didn't have them. So we're beginning to see a different market emerging. And technology, we're demonizing it on one hand, but it can liberate us, and we need to see things as opportunities. So this idea of a sharing culture, we find very optimistic. I think half our staff in the studio don't have driving licenses. They don't see the need for them, and they think they're probably right, because in 5 years' time, they probably can call a car that will come and pick them up, and 10 minutes after it's dropping them off, it will go and pick somebody else up, which is obviously far better than the car sitting on my drive for 7 days of the week, going rusty. So we also see the impact of this as real estate and the population increases and we have more and more space pressure. How do we use space more intelligently? And it's something that we try and build into all our projects. How big does it need to be? How much material do we need to use? How many do we really need? And in the office landscape, we've done quite a few projects now, starting with Parks and Benet 10 years ago, and for the last 5 years we've been building a big collection with Technion, which looks at how you use space to make people work effectively. And in doing so, in sharing product, you're obviously using far less material. So actually the intelligence of how we use product, share product, build product with multifunctions is a very easy way of using less material. So for us, the future is quite interesting from that perspective. But it raises another question, which is human beings are only going to adapt behaviors if, in our perspective, they are natural. If you impose something on somebody that they don't want, they will react against it. So another thing that we try and do in the practice when we get briefs is say, where are you getting this brief from? Why is this brief on the table? Quite often in the past, clients would say, well, our competitor has one. We'd like one too. So we generally challenge that and say, well, could we ask the question in another way? Why do they have one in the first place? And do you need one? Or could we design something slightly different? We try and roll back and work out what the need is. And a few years ago, we built an exhibition installation which was using these big wooden tubes. And we rearranged them over the course of 7 days in very different configurations. It was also, the exhibition space was a cafe, to see how people reacted, to see whether it produced private areas where people would cluster, areas where people would come down and work, or whether actually nobody wanted to be in the space. And we recorded it over 7 days as a kind of experiment. And the effect was quite enlightening. This is really absolutely blindingly obvious, but it's amazing how slow companies have been to do it. And it's the idea of repair. You know, clearly you want your product to last as long as possible. But what happens at the end of the product? Now, Howe came to us with a very joined-up idea of what this was. They didn't want to use chrome, for example. They said, this isn't good, it's difficult to recycle, we'll only paint the metal legs. They also said, which was quite entrepreneurial at the time, we want to do a plastic chair, but we don't want to use any glass fiber in it. Now, glass fiber makes plastic very stiff, which means you can bend the rules in a way and make plastic do things which it doesn't really want to do. However, it does make it slightly difficult to recycle. So they said, we want to use polypropylene, which is a very floppy material, but we want you to design it in such a way that it satisfies all the tests, lasts forever, but when we do get to the end of the life, we'll take it back and recycle it. So we don't want any glass fiber in it. So it resulted in a very wavy shape form, a bit like a Pringle. It's very stiff. However, one of the things about polypropylene is it's a kind of very peculiar material which has static attraction. So all the soot and dust, the microparticles in the air, tend to get sucked onto the surface. And you'll all have seen this, how plastic chairs get grubby. They're also very difficult to wipe down. So we developed a texture on the back, which means that you can wipe down the chair very easily. And our intention was that would allow you to prolong the life, because if people see it as being clean, they'll see it as being new. So we try and build in as, you know, from the macro, from the brief, right down to the detail of how we literally fettle away, chip away at a product typology to try and produce the optimum. And this is something that, as furniture designers, at our heart, we love furniture. Tom and I are always showing each other bits of furniture that we've seen at the weekend and things. And when you walk past an antique shop, we always ask ourselves, why is that chair there? And it's sometimes to do with its craft value. You can intrinsically see it's been loved into existence. Sometimes it's to do with the materiality, sometimes it's to do with the build, sometimes it's to do with the design. Now, clearly, if you build quality into products, you've got, we believe, a very high chance that they'll be loved, and somebody later on will love it too. Building quality quite often does cost money. But I think, again, a bit like this notion of the, you know, as I was saying earlier, people expect to be able to buy everything. Maybe we should be saving up for things and spending a little bit more money. Apparently 95% of all Rolls Royces are still drivable. You have to ask why. It's not just because they were made well. There's a sort of value connection there. Now, obviously, not everybody can drive a Rolls Royce, and the dynamic is not as simple as saying expensive is good. You know, sometimes cheap things are good. Now, ironically, if you're flying economy class is much better than flying business class, because clearly many more people are in an aircraft. However, the market, we've driven cheap air travel, not the airlines. They'd like to charge more money, but they're in competition with each other. So what we decided to do was try and flip this and say, well, over the 20 years we've been working in aviation design, the seats have got closer and closer together. The value experience of traveling has got pretty nasty. Can we give something back to try and promote economy travel, which, if you're going to fly, it's the best way to travel? So we designed a seat that was much smaller in terms of its packaged size, which then gives more visual space back to the user and gives you a sense of space that basically our cheap tickets had removed. So it was trying to change perception whilst recognizing the reality of market forces. So design can respond to those market forces, but it can also change behavior. And we got asked by Joseph, a kitchenware manufacturer, about 6 years ago, to design some kitchen bins. And that was really the brief. They just wanted to get into the bin market. And we said, well, we don't really want to do that. We'd like to design some recycling stations for you. Let's think of it more like that. We saw that there was an opportunity to try and educate people. We know that when you throw things away and separate them, quite often they still end up in landfill. But the act of separating creates conscious understanding of your consumerism. So when you actually separate all your packaging into plastic, all your packaging into paper, and all your food waste, first of all, you're saying, gosh, I'm throwing away food. Secondly, you're saying, I'm purchasing this amount of plastic. So making things visual is incredibly important for human beings, for them to understand and gain context. So we designed these bins that the user could reconfigure, because everybody's purchasing is very different. You know, some people don't purchase plastic, they'll only go for paper packaging, but you still need to separate it. So you can decide how you reconfigure the bin. And now this has spawned basically a new brand for them. We have about 6 or 7 products with them. This was a very nice project, and as Tom was saying, you know, our purchasing opportunities now are completely different with Amazon and the online. You know, we don't even have to go to a shop anymore. Actually, this can be turned to a positive advantage. And Tact, this rather lovely Danish company, startup company, 2 years old, year old, came to us and they said, well, actually, we'd like to turn this to a positive. We're going to source all the materials, sustainable materials, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the fact that we can sell direct to allow us to sell a much higher value product to the end user for less price. Because if you cut out the middleman, you can buy it cheaper and we can make it better, which was an interesting proposition. So we designed this flat pack chair, and in the process of designing it, you know, we learnt a few things ourselves which are kind of obvious. But for example, the flat object here that we've got on the left, made out of 4 components and 6 screws, can be packaged into 1/6 of the volume of a pre-glued chair. So every time I buy 1 chair, I can buy 6 of these packaged ones. Now the implications for shipping, and the reality is it's going to be made in a factory somewhere and shipped somewhere else, are huge. You're saving 6 times the fuel. You can have 6 times as many chairs on the road in 1 truck. And even when you get it to your destination, you might only have 2 or 3 deliveries as opposed to 10 to fill up that shop or that office space. So the findings were really interesting. The wins were really interesting. And even the customers liked the fact that they could store them in the room in 1 pile as opposed to having to plan how to get them into the buildings. So there's a little movie here, and this is kind of a reminder that design isn't perfect, because there's a little error in the middle of this movie, if you can pick up on it, of Tom and I installing it. And even though we designed it, we got the installation slightly wrong. And I guess, you know, after 20 years, it's a reminder for us, in many ways, this project, that there are so many ways in which we can improve the process and discover new methods for making projects, better products, more carefully designed. We're not going to stop consumerism. And as 2 sort of fairly interested parties, we'd much rather be in the industry making conscious, careful decisions than outside the industry. So there was a little bit in the middle where we got the X the wrong way round. And as Tom was mentioning earlier, it's, you know, we'd rather be in the industry, and it can't all be doom and gloom. And we actually think that at the end of the day, human nature, we need design. It's here for a reason, because actually people need to be delighted. And if you're delighted with a product, you're much more likely to look after it. So for us, it's not, you know, we're not going to remove cheap. We're not going to be able to say you can always make it expensive and therefore people will look after it. We have to, at every step of the way, try and think about how you can build in value so that people look after it. And it's, you know, the whole chain is really a re-education process. So, you know, it's sometimes just about simplicity, being humble and trying to touch human qualities, which mean we respect the things that we make and the environment around us, and we'd like to leave it like that. Thank you.